Hello everyone, welcome back. I hope your day is starting off just fantastic. Let's introduce the video here with this beautiful picture provided by Suzanne in the I Choose Canada group. And this shot was taken from the top of the Giant in Sleeping Giant National Park in Ontario, which is right beside Thunder Bay. Look at the perspective there. It looks pretty amazing. Perspective. All right, that's I guess the key word for this video. I'm going to present some information for you on a topic I haven't covered yet, and that is the deal between Danielle Smith and Alberta and the federal government regarding the pipeline, what do they call it? The memorandum of understanding. And I'm interested in your comments of what you think of that deal and what's happened. But before you leave your comments, let me present some information for you. First, I'm going to briefly recap what that deal is, and I'm going to summarize the positions of some of the major political people that are involved, what their positions are. And their positions tell us a lot. Just a few minutes on that. And then I'm going to focus in on one particular aspect of this deal, which I think has been really underreported. And I think it's been underreported because a lot of journalists just really don't understand the topic. And I'm going to give you some information on it. Reported on Global News. Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith have signed a memorandum of understanding that commits them to working towards building an oil pipeline to the West Coast. At the signing ceremony on Thursday, the two agreed to terms that commit Ottawa to adjusting the West Coast tanker ban if a pipeline project is approved as a project of national interest under the Building Canada Act. The Building Canada Act is the new Bill C-5 that the government unanimously approved in the House of Commons with support of the Conservative Party at the time, and that this project provides opportunities for Indigenous co-ownership and shared economic benefits. In return, Alberta has agreed to implement an industrial carbon price of $130 per ton by April 1st. And finally, and this is the detail that is just quickly mentioned in reporting, the agreement pairs the pipeline project to the proposed Pathways Alliance carbon capture project, and government officials say that the two projects must be built in tandem. So I'll spend some time at the end of the video talking about this carbon capture Pathways Alliance that is really vague in a lot of people's minds. But first, the reaction. What has been the reaction? Well, there's two ends to the spectrum, starting with the side that is dead set against any pipeline ever being built on the West Coast, and that would be Elizabeth May, the leader of the Green Party. That was expected. And a Liberal cabinet minister, Stephen Guilbeault, who was the former Minister of the Environment under the previous Liberal government led by Justin Trudeau, he resigned his cabinet position within the Liberal government and said he's completely against this deal and against any pipeline. And it lays his cards on the table because he was the guy, he was negotiating, or the lead negotiator, the Minister of the Environment, who was, I guess, pretending and going through the motions of negotiating with Alberta and really frustrating the Premier. And she was very vocal about how she was frustrated with negotiating with him. And he had never any intention of ever making a deal, it would seem. He's basically said that through his resignation. He's completely against a pipeline. So at the same time that he was negotiating with Alberta and trying to work on some compromise, in his mind he had already decided that he was against any deal and was simply negotiating, I guess, for show. Whether he remains as a Liberal MP in the future or whether he joins the Green Party is up to him. The other person that's made their position clear and their party's position clear is this guy, Pierre Poilievre. And he's taken the position to be to the right of Danielle Smith. He's called this deal not a pipeline deal, but a pipe dream, and is completely against it, and has taken the position that everything about this deal is just a waste of time. And what really should happen is that the federal government should just step out of the way, and we should just approve the pipeline and start building it, even though there's really no pipeline project being proposed yet. This is the framework of how to get there. But he's taken the position that he even disagrees with Danielle Smith. And his position is he would never negotiate that the issue of climate change or CO2 emissions or linking a potential future pipeline with the Pathways carbon capture project, linking those, is irrelevant. He doesn't believe in climate change, and he's laid the position that Conservative Party, federal Conservative Party, doesn't care at all about CO2 emissions or the climate. There's no plan to even acknowledge that and that the project should just go ahead. Those are the two endpoints, the carrot and the stick. The one group that doesn't want a pipeline using the stick on oil companies, no, you will not have any pipeline under any circumstances. And Pierre Poilievre using the carrot, oh, wait a minute, he's not using a carrot. What he's saying is he will just open the zoo doors and let the animals rush out and be wild and do whatever they want. Who's using both the carrot and the stick? Well, that would be Mark Carney and Danielle Smith. So let me give you a little bit of information on this one aspect of the deal that ties any new future pipeline to this CCS project, the Carbon Capture and Storage Project, the Pathways Alliance project. And the first reaction a lot of people have, and the media has as well, they perpetuate this, is that carbon capture and storage is a concept, it's not proven, it's new technology, and it might not work. But I'll point out to you that carbon capture and storage is already occurring, but it's not called carbon capture and storage where it is occurring. Let me give you one example. And you can look this up on Wikipedia and get some pretty good information about it. It's called the Weyburn-Midale Carbon Dioxide Project. Weyburn, being the location of a fairly large oil field in Saskatchewan, was, as of 2008, the world's largest carbon capture and storage project. This article describes this now, today, as a carbon capture and storage project, but when it started, it was more of a enhanced recovery project. The Weyburn oil fields covers an area of some 52,000 acres and has a current oil production of about 3,000 barrels a day. Original oil in place is about 1.4 billion barrels. In October 2000, Cenovus, formerly Pan-Canadian and Encana, began injecting significant amounts of carbon dioxide into the Weyburn field in order to boost production. This little piece of a map explains it. This project was done in cooperation between two companies, one in the United States and one in Canada. A business in Beulah, North Dakota, that was emitting a lot of CO2, made a deal with the operators of this Weyburn-Midale oil field, and there was a pipeline constructed, this is this red line on the map here, where CO2 was captured from the business in North Dakota and sold to the oil company that was running the oil field in Saskatchewan. Why would they buy this CO2? Because it was profitable for them to inject the CO2 into the ground and increase the recovery of oil in their oil field. So they worked together and they've been using enhanced recovery of injecting CO2 into this oil field to increase its production for decades now. So the technology exists to capture the CO2 and to re-inject it into the ground. Up till now, every use of it in Canada has basically been to provide enhanced recovery of more hydrocarbon. And what the Pathways Alliance project represents is to do this on a huge scale. And I'm here now on the Pathways Alliance website where they explain the process. And it's a very good web page, lots of good information on here. I'll leave the link of it in the video description so you can read more about it yourself. But let me just show you some of the key things and then try and explain to you the magnitude of what this means for the environment. On their website here, they explain the 3 steps that are necessary for the project. And the first step is to capture the CO2. And this technology exists. I'll explain this more in a moment, but just look at the pretty diagram here. Step number 1 is to carbon capture and storage is proven technology that can be implemented now. It makes it possible to capture, oh, and it went away. What's going on here? And it makes it possible to capture CO2 emissions so they don't end up in the atmosphere. A chemical compound such as amine captures CO2 from the emissions. Remaining nitrogen and water vapor are released. Using heat, the CO2 is separated from the amine. CO2 is compressed and turned into a liquid which can flow through a pipeline. That's the capture project. Number 2 is the transport process. And this is showing you Fort McMurray and all the oil sands operations, capturing the CO2 and pipelining it to Cold Lake. Let's read the caption here. An approximately 400-kilometer long pipeline could connect up to 20 production facilities to the storage hub. They would capture all the CO2 that's emitted in their facilities, and they would put it in this pipeline in liquid form, send it down to Cold Lake, where they would build a facility, and they would inject the CO2 deep underground into a geological formation, a porous layer of sandstone that can hold the CO2 that's capped by shale, where it will be trapped forever underground. Now, who is this Pathways Alliance? Canadian Natural Resources, Cenovus, ConocoPhillips, Imperial, and Suncor. We're 5 of Canada's largest oil sands companies working together to provide energy the world needs while advancing environmental innovation and projects. Okay, so those were just some pretty pictures put together on a nice website that some oil companies put together, explaining how carbon capture and storage works. And many of you are probably not sold yet because that was an oil company website. And many of you probably still have the doubt in your minds that, well, how can they really capture the carbon? And is this really a proven technology? Let me give you a little bit of an explanation here, just on something that's happening every day in Canada right now. An example of a company, an oil company that drills a well in northeast British Columbia, a NDP-run province that also has oil and gas production. A company drills a well in northeast BC now that ends up being a gas well. And the average person that's listening to this will think, okay, so gas will come out of that well and they will sell the gas. They might drill another well and find oil. Oil will come out of that well and they'll sell the oil. But it's not so simple. Let me explain what I mean. Let's say the company drills a well and it's a gas well. Most of what comes out is in gas form. It doesn't need a pump jack. Well, it's not the form of gas that you would see on your gas stove when you turn it on to do your stir fry. All right, it's not the gas that you would buy to work your furnace at home. What's included in that gas can be a big variety of different hydrocarbons and CO2. And what the company has to do after drilling that well is to process that gas at a processing facility. What they do in those processing facilities is strip everything off that gas other than basically pure methane, which is what you burn in your furnace and on your stove. There's lots of different hydrocarbons that are mixed in with that gas, different types of molecules that are heavier than methane. They call those natural gas liquids, and they have the technology to strip those out. Why would they spend the money and build those big facilities to strip those off? Well, the big reason is because they're very valuable and they can sell those. Those NGLs can be sold for a lot of money and be used in many different things. And they fetch a much higher price per barrel than, say, a Western Canada heavy oil select. They're very high quality hydrocarbon. So the company can afford to build a very expensive processing plant that's capable of stripping as much of those liquids off and sell them at a profit. If they did not strip off those NGLs and you burn the gas on your stove, you would have a lot more dirty emissions. They would burn, but there would be much more emissions. And that's why Canadian oil and gas companies talk about Canada having very clean natural gas. It's because they stripped off all the heavier molecules. There's something else that they strip off, something that's necessary to remove from that natural gas before you burn it in your fireplace or on your stove. What do you think that is? That's CO2, and that's also separated from the gas in these gas processing facilities. Now, no one wants to buy the CO2, but companies do remove it and send almost pure methane to your house for your furnace and your gas stove. What do they do with that CO2 if they can't sell it? What do they do with it right now? Well, unfortunately, they just blow it out into the air. And governments, the BC government lets them do it, the Alberta government lets them do it, the Saskatchewan government lets them do it. All governments that regulate the oil business simply allow companies to release the CO2 into the atmosphere. And some of the wells, some typical gas well may have 10, 20% of its volume is CO2 that's stripped off and just sent into the atmosphere. In the oil sands, the tremendous amount of energy that's needed after mining this tar mixed with sand to process that, to remove all the sand, to clean that product, to make it something that's worth selling as a hydrocarbon, as a heavy oil in the oil sands production process. These companies, those same companies that we read the list of, are spewing tons and tons and tons and tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every day. Alberta is the biggest emitter of CO2 in all of Canada, and the oil sands operations from those companies that I listed are by far the biggest chunk of that CO2 emission. The total reported CO2 emissions from oil sands operations in Western Canada were about 80 megatons in 2023. They use the word megatons because no one knows what a megaton is. 1 megaton of CO2 is equal to 1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. 1 megaton is the equivalent of 1 billion kilograms of CO2. Oil sands operations in Alberta in 2023 released 80 million metric tons of CO2. All of that could be captured at those companies' processing facilities. All of that can then be put into a pipeline that those companies would build from Fort McMurray to Cold Lake, where they could inject that CO2 deep into the ground in one of the deepest formations in Western Canada, effectively not venting that CO2 into the atmosphere. So now, before you pass judgment and leave your comment on whether you agree or disagree with this deal, let me just put into perspective now what these two agreed on. And it also tells us a lot about what Danielle Smith was thinking, who was always acting to try and get a pipeline project secured for Alberta. That was her goal. And I did a video months ago, around the time of the election, where I made the case, and I'm correct, that she was more interested in seeing Mark Carney win the election than Pierre Poilievre, and actively worked to help Mark Carney win the election. And this is her position now. She was glad to sign this agreement and use this carrot and stick approach, basically committing her province and her province's industry to doing something that I would describe as a massive step of removing CO2 emissions and reducing CO2 emissions in Canada, a step that Pierre Poilievre would just like to skip. He's made the comment that this deal is just a pipe dream and these two should just get out of the way and let a pipeline happen. But she's agreed with Mark Carney. This is a compromise, a deal, carrot and stick, where yes, the federal government will allow a pipeline. They'll make the condition so a pipeline can eventually be built to the West Coast. They would be lenient on the tanker ban and have an exemption for tanker traffic to come and collect the oil on the West Coast. That's controversial. They've agreed that they would put this project on the fast track list if a private company steps up and says they want to build it. The federal government has given that, and the Alberta government has basically given back this plan that the oil companies have to capture all the CO2 that they generate in the production and inject it into the ground instead of spewing it into the atmosphere. And let me put that in perspective now, because a new pipeline, if a new pipeline goes ahead, it's not even guaranteed that it'll go ahead, but if it does, and that pipeline is built and can carry 1 million barrels a day, the only way Alberta will be able to produce an extra 1 million barrels a day is to have an expansion of the oil sands. The oil sands right now produce about 4 to 5 million barrels a day. So you're talking about a 20%, 25% expansion in oil sands production. So we would have an extra 20%, say, of oil sands production from Alberta that we would sell to the world market. Now we'll compete with the rest of the world to sell our product. Whether we increase our production or not, if world demand demands that product, they'll get it from someone, all right? So our production will increase 20%. The oil companies would want to do that. They'll make more money if they can produce 20% more oil, but they will have to build this carbon capture project, the Pathways Alliance, in tandem, which will capture all the CO2 generated, not just from that 20% extra oil production, but from everything they produce, effectively getting their CO2 emissions for production of oil sands oil in Canada down close to zero. And you may ask, well, if they know how to do it and the technology exists, and you showed us that example where they're doing it in Saskatchewan anyway, well, why don't they just do this? Why do they have to have a deal to do this? Well, because it costs a fortune. This carbon capture project that we're talking about here would be about as big as a new pipeline project to the West Coast. This would combine, the two would probably represent the biggest industrial project that Canada's ever embarked on. It could be a project that's in the 40, 50, 60, 70 billion dollar range to do the whole thing. And we've already seen what happens when you just use the stick approach. It was just a stalemate that would never get anywhere. It's very difficult to convince private companies to do something just with the stick, because they have other options. They could just shut down and cease operations and go to other countries and operate. So at the end of the day, you have the ironic situation that the former environment minister, that's 100% against pipelines and 100% against oil and gas production, was not able to achieve anything other than friction between the federal government and the Alberta government. He didn't really achieve any meaningful CO2 reductions, but this compromise that these two have just signed could end up being the largest decrease in CO2 emissions in Canadian history. And in fact, if you do the research on this one project, this Pathways Alliance, it could probably represent one of the biggest decreases of CO2 emissions in the world, because the oil sands they're a massive project, even on the world scale. And if we can convert all of that production, the energy used to produce, and have a zero CO2 emissions footprint, that's huge. Now, this has nothing to do with the oil being burned once it's sold, okay? That's a different story, because I know that some of you who are very environmentally aware obviously will say, well, they're going to burn the oil down the road anyway, and burning oil is what's getting us into this mess in the first place. And you're absolutely correct, and that's the topic for another video. But this step here, this compromise, puts us in a position where we can decarbonize the whole industry by allowing them to continue to operate and increase their production. That's a compromise. So the two ends of the spectrum, those who are completely against, like Stephen Guilbeault and Elizabeth May, unfortunately, their tactic, their strategy would never lead to any reductions in CO2. It's just not going to fly. It will not be accepted by the majority of Canadians. The other end of the spectrum, the guy who's ready to just open the zoo doors and let the companies out and operate like the Wild West, that's Pierre Poilievre. Hopefully Canadians don't choose that option, because that would be a disaster environmentally as well. And I'm shocked to say that the moderate all along here, who is right above me signing the deal, Danielle Smith, this was her goal, and she achieved her goal with Mark Carney in this compromise. So leave some comments in the comment section and let me know what you think of the deal now that I've given you my bit of information. Hopefully I've just sparked some interest for you. I'll leave that Pathways Alliance website linked in the video description here. And if you want to go back and watch an older video where I predicted that this was Danielle Smith's plan all along, and this is why she made it difficult for Pierre Poilievre during the election campaign, I'll link that in the top right corner of the video. Watch that. And this has been a long video, so you may not want to listen to me for a full hour in one day. But if you have a chance, listen to that video, because this was her plan all along. It's a compromise, and I'm interested in hearing what your take is. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying my content. If you want to support me in the work I do researching this stuff, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. Have a fantastic rest of your day, everyone, and I'll catch you all on the next one.